Welcome to the British Food History Podcast. I am your host, Neil Buttery, food historian and chef. Today, my guest is Christina Wade, a beer historian, author and podcaster specialising in the hidden histories of the brewing trade. I'll let you know my news at the end of the episode, except for this reminder. We are now halfway through Season 9. That went quick, didn't it? So here's a call for material for the postbag edition. We've had an eclectic set of topics thus far, and if you've got any comments, questions or queries regarding them, please contact me or leave a message on social media. Let me know your opinions and questions. So it might be today, where we're talking about ale and beer in Ireland, Derbyshire oatcakes, black and white pudding, early modern cheese, regional foods in general, Bronze Age food and foodways, and bread and bakers. Or you might have a general food history question or spotted something in the news. Please let me know. Email me, neil@britishfoodhistory.com, or find me on social media or on YouTube or the Spotify app. Leave a comment there. Links to other places you can do this are in the show notes. Also, quick heads up, early bird discount for the Serve It Forth Food History Festival ends on the 15th of September, but you can still get the discount after that date if you use the code SERVE25 with SERVE written in capitals and the numbers 25 at the checkout. That's just between you and me, okay? Season 9 of the podcast is sponsored by Fruit Pig, Britain's last remaining commercial craft producer of fresh blood black puddings. Fruit Pig, aka Matthew Cockin and Grant Harper, put a huge amount of care and attention into harvesting fresh blood to create a very delicious black pudding. Also available are their excellent gluten-free black puddings, their decadent hog's pudding and their traditional haggis. They also make bacon and sell some excellent British charcuterie. Talking about comments for the postbag, I'd be very interested to know if you are fans of their stuff or if you've discovered them via the podcast. Visit fruitpig.co.uk for more details of their products and journey. Find your local stockist and access their shop. Grant and Matthew are very kindly giving listeners to the British Food History Podcast a unique special offer. 10% off your order until the end of October 2025. Use their offer code FOODHIS, FOODHIS, capital F, in the checkout. Please do support them if you can. Okay, back to today. I am talking with award-winning author Christina Wade. She's a beer historian focusing on the UK and Ireland and mostly on women. She has written an excellent book called Filthy Queens, A History of Beer in Ireland, which was published by 9 Bean Rose earlier this year, 2025. She is also the co-host of the Beer Ladies podcast and the founder of the Ladies Craft Beer Society of Ireland. You can also read her work on her Substack, Brachyatrix, and in Beer Magazine. So today we're talking about ale and beer in Ireland and how colonisation by the English and then the British affected ale and beer production and consumption. Things discussed include ale in early medieval Ireland, the person who inspired the title of her book, ale consumption during the Irish Rebellion and the Potato Famine, and the use of human skulls in medicinal ales, amongst many other things. Those listening to the Secret Podcast can hear about the links between alewives and witchcraft, the correlation between whiskey and beer consumption, tea kettle brews, and more. I'll be back at the end to tell you about my other news. But now, please enjoy Ireland, Ale and the Colonising British with Christina Wade. Welcome to the podcast, Christina. I loved reading your book, Filthy Queens, A History of Beer in Ireland. It's a pretty academic text, but very approachable. Was that one of your missions when you were writing the book?
Yeah, so I really had general audience in mind. Basically, I viewed it as I wanted to be able to tell the stories like I was telling them over a pint at a pub to a friend who might not be a professional historian. So that was sort of the audience that I had in mind. Like, can I tell this story over a pint and my friend can understand it Or am I getting too bogged down in sort of the details of it?
Oh, you definitely achieved that, I would say. One thing that I really loved were the characters, the various characters throughout the centuries, 2 millennia, in fact, really. It really helped us, or helped me anyway, connect with the times and the history. It just felt so immersive to me. Not an easy feat. So well done.
Oh, thank you.
Before we start talking about the work that you've done here, though, could you tell listeners a little bit about yourself and how the book came about?
Yeah, so I'm originally from the US, and I have been in love with history since I can't even remember. And so I sold all my belongings and only packed 2 suitcases and moved to Ireland to do my master's and my doctorate at Trinity College in Irish history. Did my PhD. And throughout the course of that, my supervisor was basically like, you need to get a hobby because academia can be very, very draining. It can be very intense. So find something that you love that can feed you. So I started the Ladies Craft Beer Society of Ireland in 2013, just maybe to get a friend or two. Now we have like 1,400 some odd members.
Blimey.
Of course, not all of them show up to every meetup, but it's a group, centered on immigrants, people who are new in town, people who are just like looking for friends. It's great. But through that, I furthered my love of beer and thought when I was done, and over the course of researching Viking burial practices, you look at like ale and its use in ritual, and I was like, you know what, this is what I really want to do. So I sort of married the two, and since completing my doctorate, I've been working on studying the history of beer in Ireland as well as in the UK. And yeah, so this book, Filthy Queens, has taken the better part of 7 years to write. So here we are.
Well, I'm not surprised that it took that long because I don't know how you got a lot of this information. It must have been so hard, the amount of stuff you had to trawl through. Was it one of those cases where you were researching something else and you just kind of happen upon things and you sort of keep a little running list of the things you happen upon? Because I'm going through a bit of a phase with that, looking at fermentation.
Definitely. You get so surprised at the things that you just sort of encounter when you're like looking at different topic that you're focused on. And then all of a sudden you see this tangent about, for example, ale is used in medicine, and this book about Irish medicinal cures in the medieval world. And you're like, oh, I need this for later, but don't forget it. Write it down. It definitely is the way.
But it shows, I suppose, how just part of the fabric of society it was that it pops up everywhere, because it seems to be relevant to everyone everywhere at all times. Certainly the early medieval period.
Absolutely. It's one of those things, food and drink really connect us. It's something that's very tangible for people. So looking at the past, and, we can all kind of relate to having an ale, maybe a pint with a friend after a long day, or, at a wedding or a funeral, or, networking over a couple beers maybe. And people have been doing that for millennia. So it's something that was just such a important part of everyday life, as well as these important events like, your weddings, your funerals, your kingship rituals. So it's something that everybody, maybe 1,000 years, 1,500 years could relate to, and we can relate to now for many of us. Even if you don't drink, you're familiar with that idea.
And of course, it's instilled so much, entwined with myth and legend. And I suppose history's entwined in all of that too. I really liked the opening chapters where you're essentially talking about rather obscure characters, like Saint Bridget, for example. She's my favourite because she's just so sassy. The way you able to conjure up the character, it's creative writing, but not creative writing where you're obviously making it up. It's to enhance, to help you immerse yourself, like I said before, in the world. How important are those stories, though, for you as a historian to help you understand what ale was and how it fit into society at the time? Because you can't take this stuff literally.
They are so critical because it tells us about what the writer knew. So the writer is talking about what the writer is familiar with. And now there's lots of things with assuming that the writer was seeing this in every day because, we have lots of, even the early Irish laws of Brehon laws were prescriptive, what they wish things would be rather than what they are.
Mm.
But when we look at these stories and we combine them with other texts and we look at the archaeology, we can see things that match up, things that align. And it gives us a glimpse into sort of the everyday life, because oftentimes we have stories of really they're very rich or, these amazing mythical characters. And sometimes these stories can give us hints in sort of like the everyday, possibly. And though a lot of them are focused on kingship and these sort of legendary figures, we can get hints of that within these tales. And yeah, as I said, when we look at sort of the other ways of approaching history, like archaeology, we can kind of see, okay, you know what, this fits, this makes sense, this was probably something that's happening. And the writer is talking about what they see, what they interact with on a daily basis.
Do you have a favourite, by the way?
Oh,
All of these early.
I'm partial to Bridget as well. I have to admit, I love the stories about Bridget. I love that she just kind of does her own thing and no one else is going to tell her anything. She's going to just do what she needs to do. And that's the end of that.
Yeah, and she becomes a saint essentially, in a changing water into wine style story, doesn't she? Except it's water into ale, which is much better.
Yeah, it's much better.
I thought that was great. Oh, one of the things I was really interested in was you mentioned in this period all the different types of cereal, the barley, oats and things like that, and how much they were very much correlated with status. You very much knew your place by the type of ale you were drinking.
Yeah, so that's one of those things that could be prescriptive, could be, we wish that this was the case. It's not necessarily what everyday lived reality might be, but a lot of things in early Irish society were associated with certain statuses. That this is what you did with this, and this person was allowed this, and this rank got this, and this. So we see that with this sort of breakdown that I go through in the book of these grains for these people. Now, whether that correlated to brewing, I'm speculating there, but it's possible. Especially, we're thinking about more expensive grain. So who would have access to those sorts of things that would be worth more? But again, prescriptive, maybe, maybe not. But yeah, it's definitely, I think, a logical conclusion based on the data that, certain people of certain status would probably have access to things that were valued higher.
And it was quite a scattered population as well. So people have been making ale out of the cereals that are in their community or just maybe in their homestead. So I guess it's an obvious correlation, isn't it, really? So I can see that. I was interested that you listed peas as a possibility.
Yeah. So
peas ale.
Now I can't prove that the medieval period, but I can tell you that several beer historians have famously found recipes that included peas in the early modern period as part of the grain bill. So not the entire grain bill, but part of the grain bill, which now I really want to make one.
Oh, that was going to be my next question. Have you ever made it? It's either going to be fantastic or awful, isn't it?
Yeah.
I will imagine you're going to be quite bubbly the next day, if you know what I mean. Having peas ale. By the time we get to the late Middle Ages and early modern period, for starters, the English are very much there, cutting their teeth before they start off their empire by practicing on poor old Ireland, Scotland and Wales. So yes, they're very much there affecting things. It seems that the old tradition, at least, again, I'm projecting and talking about England here, of alewives or brewsters has very much been ousted by professional, probably strokey bearded men all professionally making beer because the hops have been brought in. And there's this big change, isn't there, from usually women serving a household or a community to this really big scale beer production. Am I right in that that's not what happens in Ireland? You very much get that that older tradition carrying on for a good few centuries?
Women brew longer in Ireland in greater numbers than they do in England. Though I will say in England and Scotland and Wales, women still continue to brew well up into the 20th century for their households and for their communities. And particularly brewed still in England in rural areas. So there's a rural-urban divide. And then even within that, there's certain cities that women stayed brewing in longer than other cities. And and married women brewed with alongside their husbands longer than men. This was my first book. I wrote my first book on women in brewing in the UK. But in Ireland, women brewed longer commercially and at greater numbers than they did in urban areas in the UK. So when we're in the later medieval period up into the early modern period, we see women pretty much dominating the trade to some degree. The laws are written just to women for a very long period of time. And then, we throw a man in the men in there, with brewsters and brewsteresses is actually the term there. But typically up until, the 1400s, we're seeing just laws that the English are passing to women brewers. And then by the 1600s, we have people talking about how every householder's wife is a brewer. So women are still dominating the trade longer. However, men are brewing, particularly if it's a well remunerated position, should we say. So the higher status brewers tend to be male, but not always. But women absolutely did stay in brewing commercially in urban areas in greater numbers, probably longer than they did in the UK or specifically England.
Was there a split by the type of drinks? Were women usually making ale and the big commercial things was beer? Because the big change, of course, was the hops, which meant you could brew in larger amounts. So is that where the split is? Is it all down to the hops, do you think, that kind of got this ball rolling with this split? Or am I missing something?
In Ireland, it's hard to say because we still have widows and women dominating or brewing in large commercial breweries by the end of the 17th century. So are they the same amount as men? No, but their breweries rival theirs. So it's hard. I can't necessarily make that distinction. And women were brewing with hops when it first arrived, because we see a man called Barnaby Rich, who's an English army captain who retires to Dublin, complaining about the women in Ireland brewing beer, and that is a hopped beer at this time, and selling it to the English and ripping them off. So that does kind of play a role. Now, eventually ale becomes hopped as well. So everybody's using hops to some degree. Some ales aren't hopped. And it gets really kind of confusing because we start having multiple definitions of what's beer and what's ale. Like I said, sometimes ale has hops, sometimes it doesn't have hops. Beer always has hops, and ale is sometimes used to just denote a stronger drink. And it can be very, very confusing. But by the end of the 17th century, we have widows, what looks like single women still brewing in these breweries, often alongside men. And then we have men brewing, but they could be brewing alongside their wives, and their wives just aren't mentioned in the sources because they're the ones who sort of own the brewery as such. So it's really hard. I don't think we have that divide in Ireland the way you see it happening in England.
Is there a divide in the drinking habits between the colonising English and the Irish population, would you say?
That seems to be the case. It seems to be at least early on, when Barnaby Rich is talking about this, he's talking about, they're brewing beer for the English. So there does seem to be this association with Englishness, with hops, and Irishness with sort of like more of the traditional ale styles.
I don't think I've ever drunk a unhopped ale or beer in modern times. Have you?
Oh, yes.
They do appeal to me, but I don't think I've ever had one, not knowingly anyway.
Yeah, well, I recreate medieval ales. I was made a 4,000-year-old Sumerian ale one time. So I've tried them.
As you do.
And then there's gruits that people make now as well, which are herbed beers instead of hops. And there's different arguments with like what an unhopped ale could be, because we don't necessarily know that they were using like one herb as a substitute like we do with hops. So they could just simply be malt, yeast, water. They could have added herbs later on. A lot of the cooking books or the recipe books talk about adding herbs in sort of like a tea bag almost kind of a thing with like cheesecloth or linen cloth, and dunking that in and sort of soaking in the flavor. There's an argument based on, medicinal ale recipes that talk about adding all of these herbs. So there probably wasn't one herb, or there wasn't like herbs added as part of the brewing process as necessary. Like you have to add herbs. It's more of a, okay, you can add herbs here, you can add them there. If you don't want to add anything, that's okay. And if you don't add anything, then later on for all of these medicinal cures, then you add this, 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 and this. So that's a tricky one as well. What those ales might have actually looked like and what they might have tasted like.
But certainly you find evidence of what people were putting in, even if you don't get precise recipes. And there's such a huge variety. When I first started looking into this myself, I just assumed ale was beer without hops, and that was it. I didn't realize there was all these just plethora of different herbs and combinations of herbs. Because, of course, we're talking in a time, I mean, we all talk about trying to keep a healthy diet and all that kind of stuff. I have mixed success with my healthy diet. But really, when you're going back just a couple of 100 years ago, your health and what you eat are so entwined, are so important. And so religion is also entwined in that too. You can't really eke them apart. So it's no surprise, really, when I was reading it, except it was. It shouldn't have been a surprise when I was reading your book and found just how important it was from a medicinal point of view. Ale as medicine, essentially.
Absolutely. And they use things in Ireland and England and Scotland and Wales. This isn't just, an Irish thing, all sorts of herbs and herbal additions. And then they used some things that were probably not familiar with or don't sound particularly great to us. One example I came across when I was researching England and Scotland was one that called for skull. So it's a very binary gendered thing. So if you're a man, you need a woman's skull, and if you're a woman, you need a man's skull. And I guess so those are the only two genders they're working with there. And you needed someone who died a violent death. So strangulation was ideal. And you couldn't just like take up your great aunt Mildred, down the street. You had to really go out and find a person. And then you needed to dry the skull out. And then you dried it by the fire, and then you ground it up, and then you added it to your ale for this particular medicinal cure.
What was that supposed to be curing?
Yeah. So it wasn't necessarily, these herbal additives, which some of them, the combinations sound really lovely, rosemary, things like that.
Rosemary pops up a lot, doesn't it? I think that sounds fantastic, especially in the winter time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm totally here for that.
Resin taste.
I actually brewed a beer with Torside Brewing and Hop Hideout called Eliza Smith, and it called for rosemary 2 years ago, I think, and it was really, really good. It's called Eliza Smith. I think there's still some floating around, or they've made more. But yes, rosemary, very good. That one, excellent. Maybe not so much with the skull.
No, not a vegan product. No. We can certainly say that. I understand it from the point of view of, people would make cock ale or cock beer because the idea, the strength and or qualities, masculine qualities of the animal will pass into the beer and all that kind of stuff. It's like, well, that same logic, I'm assuming, does not apply to the skull. No. Unless you wanted to become a homicidal maniac or something. It's all very horror film.
Yes, it does.
You mentioned Barnaby Rich a bit ago. The stuff that he wrote down was obviously extremely useful. He deserves another shout out, of course, because he gave you the title of the book.
Yes. So Barnaby Rich was an English army captain, and he decided that he was going to retire to Dublin in his twilight years. And despite having no qualifications, credentials, or understanding of what he was writing about, he felt compelled to write this book called A New Description of Ireland.
How very English of him.
What a new concept. So he writes this, as you can imagine, horrifically biased, bigoted accounting of Irishness and Irish people, just horrific. But he takes aim at alewives, and he calls them most filthy queens. And he says they all meddle with their honesties, and they're always ripping their customers off, and that every householder's wife is a brewer, and that they, all harbor harlots and trollops or whatever, strumpets, whatever the wording that he particularly uses. which would be interesting enough. But what I find particularly fascinating is that several years later, he has to write an apology for that book, literally called like an excuse, an apology, or something to that effect for a new description of Ireland. And he apologizes to the alewives of Dublin and says, "Oh, I wasn't talking about, you good alewives, because brewing is such an important part of being a housewife. I was only talking about the bad sort, the other ones over there." And like I've said before, I've read the book Barnaby. It didn't really make that distinction at all in the first book. And then he goes to blame the whole thing on a woman. And it's just like, no, there's this woman who forgot to blush, kind of alluding to her being one of those trollops that he so mentioned before, or I should say,
Right.
being again very misogynistic and very sexist, and saying things like, "Oh, well, she's the one who spread this around. If you actually read the first book, I didn't say this. It's because this woman went around and said all these bad things about me, and she forgot to, she's this kind of woman, and so we don't want to trust her." And it's like, he's again throwing women under the bus with his misogyny. But
Hmm.
the thing is I really found, like, when I was talking to my friends about this book and I was talking to them about Filthy Queens, people were like,
Mm.
"I want to be a filthy queen." And I certainly, want to reclaim that title for
Yeah.
myself. It just seemed natural to make it the title of the book. Especially because it has that, he had to apologize for doing that.
Well, I hope those Irish alewives got T-shirts made. Filthy
Oh
Queens now.
yes, that's in the works.
Say, in the mid 17th century, there's the Irish
Mm.
Rebellion, and you put aside sort of kind of pretty much a whole chapter to looking at this. Am I right that there was the depositions of 1641? We should probably say what the depositions is, and why there was a rebellion first, I suppose, before I ask
Yeah.
anything else.
So the 1641 rebellion is a response to the colonization of English and Scottish Protestant settlers. So the English original invasion and colonization wasn't particularly successful. They got pushed back. We have something called the Regalicization of Ireland. And then they recolonize. And this is brutal. They colonize the island and they engage in what is called the plantation system, where they take away land, property from Catholic Irish people and give it to these English and Scottish settlers. Now, obviously, this didn't go over well. And that's just the extreme simplification. There were all these other strict laws against Catholics, people, punishing Catholics for being Catholic. And there's a lot more to it. But we're going to talk about the land right now. So
Sure. Okay.
there were a series of rebellions and efforts to kind of take their country back, or their land back. Country, probably not the right word, because we're not talking about it like today.
Yes, indeed. Yeah.
So the big one is this sort of 1641 rebellion. And there's a lot to that. So I'm not going to get into the details of that. But suffice to say, the Catholic Irish rose up to take the property back from their Protestant neighbors, invaders, colonizers. And this, unfortunately, in the end, was not successful. But what came out of this is these 1641 depositions. Now, these are one of the most contested documents in Irish history, possibly the most contested, because they're written
Right.
by the colonizing government, interviewing the people that are, doing the actual colonizing on the ground, the settled
Hmm.
colonizers and living in Ireland, and with the
Hmm.
view of trying to justify their colonization and these more stringent and strict penal laws that they'll start enacting, and just the horrific things that they do. So they are so biased. And then we also don't have, an equivalent of, for Irish people talking about what the Protestants colonizers were doing to them. And I shouldn't just say it's not necessarily a Catholic Protestant thing. It's a colonizer versus, original inhabitant sort of a thing.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
So I should
Yes.
be very clear about that. it's a very biased source because even the original sort of English invaders from the medieval period have what we call now gone Old English. A lot of them remained Catholic and they sided with the Irish. So it is a very contested period of time. And I'm trying to use my words very carefully because it's really hard to articulate without trying to offend and by giving justice to how difficult and horrific a time period this was for the Irish people while still acknowledging that some horrible things happened to those people who were settled in or part of the colonizing process in Ireland. Massacres occurred and things of that nature. So, there were horrors everywhere. And so within these documents, I explore the use of ale and beer and how this is either people are drinking it with the armies are drinking it, they're running on it, they want ale and bread, they want beer and bread, or, these depositions are talking about Irish people stealing malt or beer or brewing equipment. There's one famous story about a woman being forced to brew after they kill her child. So it's a very good source for looking at the way ale and beer were used in the mid 17th century, but it is a very difficult source to work with, not just because of it's so contested, but it's really hard to read, some of these atrocities as a human being. And it is hard to sort of disentangle where that bias is coming in as well.
Yes, that's a problem with propaganda. Most of it's completely fabricated. Sometimes there's the tiniest, most minuscule grain of truth that's just blown out of proportion or twisted in some way. So it's hard, I seem, to wade through it all and work out what's actually going on here, especially when you don't have, like you say, the alternative account, the balance of the people who are living in Ireland, have long been living in Ireland, but haven't written their side of the story down. So yes, treading carefully. So I guess that there are all these thefts. Ale, I suppose, if bread's the other thing that's mentioned, they're the two most limiting factors when it comes to, I suppose I'm going to say armies marching on their stomachs, but this sounds like it's actually more like smaller skirmishes and more like a thinly veiled sort of web of people fighting rather than sort of pitched battles.
Yes,
Is that
yes.
right?
Yeah, definitely. We're not necessarily talking about, two armies, World War I or World War II style, engaging in that way. A lot of it does seem to be smaller skirmishes or doing what they could do when they could do it. Yeah, so there's a lot of that. But the Irish fighters, the Irish army is stealing what they can do to support their fighters who are, sometimes taking this fort or taking this castle or taking this, land and then holding it and then, potentially losing it and then gaining it again and then doing what they can do at different times. So yeah, they're taking what they can to survive when they can, which is something, that the other army is doing as well. And they're accused of stealing it. And that's logical. Like that would be the case.
Yeah, I mean, it serves a double purpose, surely. It's stuff that you really want, and by taking it away from the other side, it's causing them an issue too. So you can see why it was done. Moving on to the 18th century, one thing that I had no knowledge of whatsoever was the Porter War, or Porter Wars, between the English, I guess the new wave of colonising English, or British, should I say, and the Irish plus Old English, which are kind of now a sort of more one cohesive group now, at least from the point of view of beer. How did this Porter War come about? Actually, we should probably say what a porter is before we carry on.
This is a really difficult question because
you're
correct. Because what we conceive of porter and stout today aren't necessarily what they conceived of porter and stout back in the day. So Martin Cornell and Ron Pattison have found, pale stouts and pale porters. So that sort of like singular definition of what a porter or what a stout is doesn't particularly work in the 18th century, because our modern sort of understanding is that a stout is sort of like a higher ABV with this unmalted roasted barley. That would be kind of how we might conceive of it
Mhm.
now, but both would be probably darker beer. Not the case in the 18th century necessarily. A stout in particular could be used to apply to any sort of stronger beer. It's
I
kind of
see.
hard to really kind of pin that down. So Martin Cornell has written an amazing book that I can't wait to read. I know it's going to be amazing, on the history of porters. So that should kind of hopefully answer this question for us in a little bit more detail.
Oh, good.
So English porters are really popular, and they're pushing out Irish porters and Irish brewers to the point where, Irish brewers are complaining about this problem. And we see imports of English porter from the beginning of the century are very low to, thousands and thousands of
Mm.
barrels at the end of the century. And this becomes something that is not only tied to brewing issues and commercial issues, but it becomes tied to political aims and nationalism and Irishness. And this idea of drinking Irish porter is a patriotic move, and you should be drinking Irish porter as a patriot. And some shop owners saying, we're only going to sell Irish porter. Here's this affidavit I've printed in the newspaper because I'm only going to sell Irish porter because I'm, a good Irish patriot, and this sort of
Mhm.
association. So it's a very important part of what forms politics in the 18th and into the 19th century.
One of the most tumultuous events to occur to Ireland was the Potato Famine. Did that affect beer or ale
So
brewing?
the Great Hunger, I think between the period that it existed, something like 155 breweries shut down around that time. But the people who passed away, the people who immigrated, the people who were victims of this human rights violation were not necessarily the people that were drinking ale. They were really, really poor. I go through sort of looking at the poverty and sort of this beer gap of people who drank and what their social and economic status was. And a lot of the people who were killed by the famine and then by the British response to the famine were incredibly poor and weren't drinking beer because they simply could not afford it. So the question I get is, oh, wouldn't, beer demand decline? Well, that's not the drinking population. As horrific and as sad as that is. In fact, after that's not to say there wasn't an immediate impact. There absolutely was. But long term, what we see is the sort of advent of these massive commercial breweries that are made by the consolidating other breweries. So we lose these breweries, but we lose them to other breweries, sort of buying them up. Not always. Sometimes they just shut because there's an argument that other historians have made about in the advent of the railway system, Guinness gets into these smaller towns that they didn't have access to before, which results in competition between Guinness and these smaller breweries, and the breweries do not win.
Right. Just getting their
Yeah.
little tendrils in. It's like
Mhm.
Coca-Cola Company. Guinness, it's like Coke. That's controversial, isn't it? But they knew what they were doing, let's say. They certainly knew what they're doing. It's time to wrap up. The book is so fascinating. It's just so rich with broad brushstroke sort of history, but then you really focus in on all these different characters, like I say, and it just makes it a really compelling read. And you can't say that about most history books. Compelling read. But I really enjoyed it. I whizzed right through it. Sometimes it's quite hard going, isn't it, reading through a dense history book, and you can only handle a few pages before you have to go and have a lie down. But yeah, I thought it was great. All I have to say is thank you very much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful.
Thank you very much, Christina. There are links to both of Christina's books, Filthy Queens, A History of Beer in Ireland, and The Devils in the Draft Lines, 1,000 Years of Women in Britain's Beer History. Plus there's links to her podcast, the Ladies Craft Beer Society of Ireland, and much more. There's also a link to a blog post about cock ale that I wrote quite a while ago, if you want to know more about that. And there are links to other episodes pertinent to today's if you want to find out more about the history of ale and beer. There's Making Medieval Ale at Home with Alison Kay and Recreating 16th Century Beer with Susan Flavin and Mark Meltonville. Now, don't forget, all of the guests have now been revealed for the Serve It Forth Food History Festival on the 18th of October. You can find descriptions of all of the events on the site. There's a link in the show notes. Tickets are £16 via Eventbrite. There's a link in the show notes about that too. And remember to use that code, SERVE25. In other news, I popped up on the Around the Table podcast talking about my approach to food history and cooking historical foods. It was fun. So there's a link there in the show notes, and there's a post on the blog about the old classic pudding known as junket. That one is just for subscribers. If you can support the podcast and blog financially, you can donate a one-off coffee or pint or start up a monthly £3 subscription to receive access to those bonus blog posts. Go to britishfoodhistory.com and click on the Support the Blog and Podcast tab, where you can find out more about all of the benefits of being a subscriber, including getting access to the secret podcast. But there's all sorts of other ways to support, so spread the word or keep spreading the word. Leave positive reviews and rate the podcast, please. 5 stars if you can. And we're getting there. We got to number 11 in the UK Apple Food Podcast chart. Just one away from the top 10, so close. The mixing and sound engineering was done by Thomas Ntinas of the Delicious Legacy podcast. I recommend checking out his 3-parter on medieval food in Europe from a couple of years ago. It is very good and certainly worth a listen. But it's time for me to go now. Cheerio.